Pat Shurmur's gone, but was he really the problem? Matt Rhule being labeled as a potential head coach fit, and just moments before this thing going on air, Chris Richard being mentioned as a potential head coaching candidate for the New York Giants. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Giants Brawl podcast, brought to you by the Brawl Network. As always, I'm your host for this evening, Usayd Koshal. You can follow me on Twitter at Usayd Koshal. And then I'm joined by Empire sports media legend Anthony Rivardo, who you can follow on Facebook at you can follow on Twitter at Anthony_Rivardo. Anthony, how's it going today, man?
It's going well. I had a good holiday, and I was greeted to the exciting news this morning that Pat Shurmur was finally fired.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring him up, right? Because the Giants fan base all throughout 2019. I mean, this was prevalent in 2018 too, but just super prevalent in 2019, where it's like Shurmur was the issue. He was a bad play caller. There were so many issues there. But like really, I think when you look at it, the biggest issue of all, and now Shermer's obviously gone, but when you look at the entire situation and you break it down detail by detail, I think the biggest issue is still Dave Gettleman.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that on our last episode with our guest Will, and I definitely agree. I think that they both should have gotten the boot, but we got one of them gone, and we just got to hope that we get the right coach in here next, and somehow he can gel with Dave Gettleman, and we can get a winning culture in place. But I do think that's going to be difficult to do because I don't think that Dave Gettleman's the right guy for the job. We talked extensively about that and how he has poor positional value and is bad giving out big contracts to average and below average players. And I don't see him as being the man who's going to give us a championship roster, but there's definitely people who disagree with me, and I hope that I'm wrong about it.
I know. I mean, here's the thing: you look at Gettleman in Carolina, and you're like, okay, so he did have his fair share of good drafting, decent draft picks, but at the end of the day, like, and I get he got the team to a Super Bowl, right? Well, he built like a Super Bowl roster, but he never did enough to like really make the Panthers super relevant. And so, you really do question, like, okay, what if he does the same thing with the Giants, where it's like you're sitting here in 2 to 3 years and he's built a pretty solid roster, but the roster can just never get over the hump in the playoffs.
Well, that roster that he built with the Panthers is one that you have to give him some credit for, but not all the credit because there was a lot of solid pieces there when he got there. He didn't draft Cam Newton. He didn't draft Luke Kuechly or Thomas Davis. There was a lot of good players, talented players already on the team. And while he did provide the Panthers with a lot of complementary pieces and did get the roster to the next level and got them to that Super Bowl, the main reason they got to the Super Bowl was just it was the MVP season of Cam Newton. I mean, that was a career year, one that he's never even come close to having a year like that again, and he likely won't come close to that again now with all of his injuries. But so you got to give Dave Gettleman some credit there, but not all the credit. And I don't think that he's actually shown enough to prove that he can take a roster from scratch and build it up to a Super Bowl contender.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like when you look at Shermer these last 2 years, like I mean, I get, you're judged by how many games you win and lose in the NFL when you're a coach on any team. But like, I mean, this is a guy that won 9 games over a 2 year period, was 9-23. But like at the end of the day, I mean, Shermer just had a real lack of talent. And I think that the highlight of Shermer's career where we kind of saw like, okay, this guy can work with some good talent was in 2017 when he was the offensive coordinator with the Vikings. Like they had a pretty talented roster, and it does make me wonder, like, okay, you know what? What if Shermer had like another year to kind of build an offense that that he believed could be like the future for this Giants team? Like where could that have gone? And would he have been the head coach like beyond 2020?
Well, it's interesting to think about all of the what ifs with Pat Shurmur's coaching tenure because when he got here, the roster was a complete mess, and it still is. And most particularly, you look at the defense and you say there's really nothing to work with. And he really did not have a fair shot, Pat Shurmur. He didn't. And even though he did have some solid talent on the offensive side of the ball, he fell through and didn't really execute the offense that we expected him to. We didn't see the creative play calling, and he made a lot of mistakes with time management and miscalling some timeouts, not picking the right time to go for two or go for it on fourth down, and a lot of bad play calls throughout the past two seasons, and that really was the deciding factor. I mean, he could have probably argued there's nothing on this roster for me to work with, and he would have won that argument. But even with that being the case, when the roster had a good game, the team was playing well, he still wasn't enough to get them to win games. He only got 4 wins this season, which was, we were supposed to improve this year, and we didn't. We lost an extra game. And when you get to those close fourth quarter games, so often the Giants, they would lose by one score or less, and that was because there was just a coaching error that just took them out of the game, and that's a fireable offense on any team. And I'm happy that the Giants made the right decision. I just wish that they would recognize that the bad roster is not Shurmur's fault, and there should be some sort of consequences towards Dave Gettleman too.
Yeah, and if anything, like as you begin to look forward, as we begin to look forward to future head coaching candidates for this team, because that there's a lot that they're going to bring in. I mean, this has to, with Gettleman there and Giants ownership supposedly just backing up Gettleman. I mean, this is like got to be one of the least attractive jobs, and it's going to be tough to watch because we've discussed extensively on this podcast guys like Baylor head coach Matt Rhule. We know that they're going to be interviewing Josh McDaniels as well. I mean, Eric Bieniemy, and then just about, I want to say, an hour before we recorded this, or even less than that, you're hearing that the Cowboys defensive coordinator, Chris Richard, or Richard, however you say the last name, he's going to be a guy that they're going to look to interview as well. And that interview is actually taking place on Thursday. So there's a lot of different names that are kind of being floated around.
Yeah, there's a lot of names, and I'm surprised there haven't been more defensive candidates brought up yet. I expect them to eventually take a look at Robert Saleh from the San Francisco 49ers. He's done wonders with that defense. And you mentioned Chris Richards, and I think that is really not someone who's in contention for the job. I think that's more of the Giants just meeting with someone in the division to try and get a feel for that team. I hope that's what it is. I don't think that he's a very strong candidate, but I do think it would be a wise decision to try and get some, a little bit of information on the Cowboys. I know a lot of teams around the league do that when they have a head coaching position open. They like to look towards the division and meet with some of the coordinators and position coaches on other teams just to get a slight edge here and there and get a understanding of how they do things. But you mentioned that Jason Garrett's probably on his way out, and that's another candidate that we could see the Giants show some interest in. We had some reports like last month about how the Giants would be interested in him, and I know a lot of Giants fans are saying that they hope the team stays far, far away from Jason Garrett, and I am one of those fans. I do like Matt Rhule, as you mentioned, and they are also expected to meet with Josh McDaniels at some point, and I think that he's a pretty good candidate too.
Yeah, so let's just break, some of these guys down. I mean, like, there's the thing. I think if you go with a guy like Matt Rhule, what you're getting is it's going to be a completely different direction. If you were to sit here, so here's the thing. Going into 2019, I think we all knew like Shurmur was on the hot seat and that it would have taken like a magical run or something, or at least like in a 7-9 or 8-8 season for him to save his job. But if you were to tell me that, Matt Rhule, Baylor head coach Matt Rhule was going to be one of the guys that they were going to be interviewing in like 4 or 5 short months, I would have kind of looked at you like you were crazy. But the more I look at it, I think that this would kind of be like an outside the box hire, and it would just be a completely different route that the Giants would take that we're just traditionally not even used to seeing.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about Matt Rhule in particular, and it is pretty out of the box and it's not a very ordinary thing, is that he coaches both sides of the ball. He's had experience as an offensive line coach and a defensive line coach. He's coached both sides. He even played linebacker. He really could manage the entire team. And obviously, he turned around 2 collegiate programs very quickly and into really competitive, strong programs very fast. Baylor and Temple were pretty bad programs when he got there, pretty good programs when he left. Or has not left Baylor yet, but assuming he does this offseason, they are in much better shape than when he got there. And it's the command of the roster and the leadership qualities that he has that are reminiscent of his mentor, Bill Parcells, former New York Giants Hall of Fame head coach. And that right there is enough to get Giants fans excited about this candidate. The fact that he's got a connection to New York, he's from there, and he's got a connection to Bill Parcells. But also, and like I said, the fact that he isn't ordinary, he does coach both sides of the ball is really important to me.
Yeah, there's just like certain, like, I mean, all these names that are being mentioned, Rhule, McDaniels, Ben Enemy, even Chris Richard, Richard. Sorry that I keep butchering his name for the listeners, but they all have like different qualities that you look at. And if I were to go ahead and rank these guys from like 1 to 4, let's say, of who would I want, I mean, my number one guy would obviously be Matt Rhule because like this is a Giants team. I mean, they've kind of been irrelevant the last couple of years. The arrow right now is pointing sideways. And I think if you hire a guy like Rhule, you're breathing fresh blood into this franchise. And it's something that's sorely needed because Rhule may not win a lot of games in 2020, but if there is some improvement, I think that he'll instill like some discipline that this team has sorely lacked over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and he might not win a lot of games in 2020, and who could expect him to with the Giants' current roster? And I know that we've got free agency and the draft coming up, but I can't imagine that the roster gets overturned that significantly and becomes that much more talented. I don't think they're going to be very good in 2020 either. But when Matt Rhule got to Baylor, his first season they finished 1-11. I mean, like I said, the program was a mess. But fast forward to 2019, and now he's 11-2. So he does have the ability to take a bad roster or a bad program and turn it around really quickly and make it competitive.
Yeah, and another guy you look at is Patriots offensive coordinator Josh McDaniels. And I'll be straight up honest. I mean, I'm always super wary of hiring these Patriots assistants because it's like you look at everywhere that they've gone. I mean, they've completely just sucked at their jobs. And I know people will be like, oh, well, McDaniels was the head coach in Denver 10 years ago. He was there for a year and a half, and that first year in '09, I mean, I know they started out like 8-0, but they collapsed down the stretch. And then his second season there in 2010, he didn't even end up lasting like the full year. I mean, he was gone by like mid-October or something. So McDaniels is one guy that I think you have to be intrigued by the potential, but you kind of have to stay away from because Patriots assistants just almost never work out.
Yeah, McDaniels is a bit of an iffy candidate because you know that he's got an excellent scheme. He knows how to win games, but there is a lot of question marks about his past with the Denver Broncos and even last offseason with the Indianapolis Colts. Obviously, he accepted the job and then at the very last minute pulled out of the job, and it wasn't a very classy thing to do. But it's what he did, and he wanted to remain a Patriot, and I think the Patriots paid him quite handsomely. But Josh McDaniels is someone that I think is a great candidate for another team. I don't think he's a very good candidate for the Giants simply because he's going to want a lot of control over personnel and a big say in who is on the roster and who is not. And I don't think they're going to give him that type of power. I know that's what the problem was last time, 2018, when they interviewed Josh McDaniels. He was a leading candidate for them, but his desire for roster power and roster control was too much for them. They want Dave Gettleman to be the general manager and to have the final say in roster decisions. So I can't imagine that this interview this time around is going to go any differently. I would assume that he's going to ask for the same thing and he's not going to get it once again.
Yeah, I was honestly just thinking the same thing because earlier today when I saw Adam Schefter tweeting out, oh, McDaniels is a prime candidate for the Giants head coaching job, but I kind of, just was thinking about it. I'm like, you know what? This really, if let's just assume McDaniels gets a job, it could legitimately turn into a power struggle. And I think that the Giants, just ownership being who they are, they would end up like going with Dave Gettleman right now, as opposed to McDaniels. I mean, and then you look at guys like Eric Van Enemy, who this guy, he's from the Andy Reid coaching tree. And I think that Andy Reid is by far in this generation the most successful head coach in terms of having a coaching tree. Because you look at some of the assistants he's had, I think it's John Harbaugh. You look at Matt Nagy, Doug Peterson. A lot of these guys have gone on to be successful after they've moved on from Andy Reid. And so I think Bieniemy would be like a really interesting name for the Giants.
Yeah, definitely. And you have to appreciate what he's done over in Kansas City with Patrick Mahomes. Obviously, his development was rapid. He sat his entire first season because Alex Smith he was still a good quarterback and he was winning them games. But then in year two, MVP season from Patrick Mahomes, we've never seen anything like it. And, obviously the offensive coordinator has a large part in the quarterback's development. And that's something that you definitely want to look at when you have a young quarterback like Daniel Jones, who's shown a lot of potential. It would be nice to pair him with the guy who helped Patrick Mahomes reach his level of success.
Yeah, I think like right now, so going back to those like head coach power rankings we talked about and kind of saying like, okay, who would we want and who would we not want? Bieniemy would be like my second choice for the Giants head coaching job. Let's just assume it doesn't work out with Matt Rhule because I know that we tweeted this out from the Giants Brawl Twitter account a month ago, which is at Giants Brawl. You can follow that there, ladies and gentlemen. That Rhule would apparently want a bit more control than the Giants would potentially be willing to relinquish. Now, I think that with Bieniemy, you would not end up getting that. You would just get a guy that's like, or you'd be getting a guy that's like, all right, you just go ahead, you run the team. I'll get him and gets the final say over stuff like roster decisions, draft picks, etc.
Yeah, and another thing that I like about Bieniemy is he's coming from the Andy Reid coaching tree, and coaches from the Andy Reid coaching tree have found a lot of success. I believe Doug Peterson and Ron Rivera are both from that tree, and they've been very successful, winning records, and even some Super Bowls from his former staff. But I don't think that he would look for that much roster control, like you said. But I'm also a little curious about the whole Matt Rhule reports because I don't think there's as much truth to them as people are making it seem. I don't think that there's any hatred between him and Dave Gettleman. I don't think there's anything like that. I think what really Matt Rhule wants is something that the Giants will happily give to him, and that's staff control. I think he just wants to be able to hire his coaching staff. I don't think he's too worried about personnel control. Shurmur definitely had a say in some of the personnel on the Giants roster over the past 2 years, though it wasn't that extreme like Josh McDaniels is looking for. But Shurmur did also have the ability to hire his coaching staff. He missed out on a few names, which really, really hurt the Giants' offense in the first season. He wanted to get the offensive coordinator from the Vikings, but he wasn't able to, and then he had to settle for Mike Shula, which was a Gettleman hire. But I do think that the Giants are willing to accommodate Matt Rhule and allow him to hire his own coaching staff.
Yeah, and I think that would really be key because when allowing a head coach to hire their own coaching staffs, a major key that I think not a lot of people discuss because when you look at some of the head coaches that have been hired over the last couple of years, I mean, and I'll use two examples from the NFC North here, Matt Nagy and Matt LaFleur. A lot of Matt's being mentioned on this podcast today,
Mm.
but the point is, right, is the fact that what did Nagy and LaFleur do in their first season? They made sure that the defensive coordinators in Vic Fangio and Mike Pettine, they were both there in the first seasons. I mean, so let's just say you do get, whoever your next head coach is going to be, I think you got to make an effort to kind of keep James Betcher around. The reason being is because you're going to have continuity on the defensive side of the ball. Granted, it's not a loaded defense like Green Bay's or Chicago's was, but at the same time, like that will at least allow you to kind of continue to build the offense. It's essentially just like buying time.
Yeah, personally, I disagree with that. I think that the Giants coaching staff should be completely cleaned out. Well, not completely. I do think that there is a couple of position coaches who did a fine job. Thomas McGahee, the special teams coach in particular, but I don't like James Betcher and I don't like Mike Shula. I think the coordinators let the new head coach pick his own coordinators. Get a new scheme in there and. James Betcher is one that I really don't like. I think that he did a very poor job with the defense this year, and I understand there was a severe lack of talent on the defensive side of the ball for the Giants. but there was a lot of plays you would see. It's 3rd and 2, right? And Cole Beasley's lined up outside. And what is he going to do? He's going to run a 2-yard route. So why is DeAndre Baker playing 8 yards off the line of scrimmage? Things like that happen really often, and it's not a DeAndre Baker thing completely. I know Baker had his fair share of struggles this year, but it's not just DeAndre Baker. There was a lot of situations where it's 4th or 3rd and short, or maybe even 3rd and medium, and you see the Giants cornerbacks and safeties are playing 20 yards off the line of scrimmage. The safeties are, and the corners are 10 to 12 yards off the line of scrimmage, and it's a scheme thing. His pressures that he was trying to scheme up rarely ever worked. I'm just not a believer in James Bettcher. I think that's really the coordinator that you got to clean out, and you got to start fresh on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be interesting to see what they do because, I mean, whoever the next head coach is, they could, in all honesty, retain Betcher. And I know that the Giants are picking at 4th overall, so there's a big chance that they do end up getting some, there's going to be a quality defensive talent available at that point. But, when you look at it, like, here's the deal with Betcher, right? This is a guy that was made out to be some great defensive coordinator when in reality during it, and it's because he was in Arizona, right? He was being made out to be this great defensive coordinator when in reality, like, the front office there gave him so much talent, like Pat Peterson, Tyrann Mathieu.
Hmm.
They had a really solid front seven, and now you see, like, okay, this guy doesn't have tons of talent, but the defense was just playing so undisciplined.
Yeah, undisciplined, that's a really good word. And very confused is another word I'd throw out there. There was a lot of miscommunications throughout the season. Things that should have been worked out by the end of the year just weren't. A lot of young players not developing as well as they should have, just completely whiffing in their zones, completely forgetting what coverage they're in. A lot of mental errors that you would think the coach would have ironed out by week 16 and 17, but he just doesn't. And yeah, things like that, they just confuse me. I don't know how a coach doesn't get on top of that and fix that, but that's what we saw a lot with James Betcher, and that's one of the main reasons I think he's no good.
Yeah, and here's the thing, right? Is when you have a when you have a rebuilding team, I mean, your main goal should be, and you got a young roster like the Giants, your main goal needs to be instilling discipline, and that's the first thing you should be doing, right? But like ultimately, you haven't seen any of that from Betcher. Now, let's just say some of this, undisciplined stuff was going on last year. It would have driven you crazy, but you would have been like, hey, there's a lack of talent. Some of these guys aren't even going to be part of the future. And then going into this year, when you do have some of that young talent like Baker, Dexter Lawrence, etc., some of the names we mentioned before and talked about extensively, you're not looking for them to come up with like flashy turnovers or strip sacks, etc. You just want to see a defense that's at least competing because the offense is just like Saquon Barkley, Darius Slayton, and everyone else.
Yeah, and you want to see them competing and you want to see them improving too. And I feel like we didn't see tons of improvement from week to week on these for these young players. I think DeAndre Baker did get a lot better at the end of the year for a short period of time, but then kind of regressed back towards his performances that were reminiscent of the beginning of the season. And there was just a lot of players. I mean, Lorenzo Carter, we expected him to take a huge jump this year, and he was really disappointing. He didn't make that jump, and he really didn't see the field as often as we thought he would. So, a lack of development. I know that the Giants actually did mention that in their press release today when they fired Pat Shurmur, that there was a lack of leadership, there was a lack of player development, and those are two things that they're going to be looking for in the next head coach. And I definitely think that with the next coordinator, you want someone who's proven on the defensive side of the ball to see his players improve and develop week to week.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting because it's going to be a long off season. I mean, there's like what 9 months until you're going to see the Giant 8 months, before the 8 or 9 months before the preseason begins, like 9 months until they open up the regular season in September 2020. But between now and then, I mean, it's all going to be about the NFL draft. It's going to be about free agency too. And it's like, okay, so I know the Giants, they're picking at 4th overall. Obviously, bearing some crazy miracle, in the sense that Cincinnati, is going to be taking Joe Burrow. You don't know what you're going to get with the Redskins. I mean, and then Detroit, you don't know what you're going to get from them in the draft. So, assuming that those guys don't draft Chase Young, and Young somehow falls into the Giants' lap. I mean, there's going to be a lot to look at fourth overall because Gettleman's not going to pull the trigger on a quarterback because he's made it clear that Daniel Jones is his guy, and ownership's really back that. As much as I hate to say it, you're not gonna get Chase Young. The odds of that are like 1%. And so it's like, well, what do you do at fourth overall? And I know we've discussed in the past, it's like, oh, well, you could trade down, accumulate some extra picks, and then all of a sudden, this way you do have a handful of picks and you have a couple guys on cheaper 3-4 year deals that you find, or you could just go out and draft like CeeDee Lamb or Jerry Jeudy or even Derrick Brown.
Yeah, there's a lot of options with the fourth pick, and I don't think that Chase Young's a real possibility either. But you can definitely get a nice offensive tackle. There's a lot of them in this class, and I also really like Isaiah Simmons out of Clemson. The fourth pick might be a little high for him, but the Giants are going to be in prime position to trade back this year. I mean, you've got the Dolphins at 5, and I believe the Chargers are at 6. And looking even further down the list, you've got the Raiders at 12 and at 19. So these are teams that you could see potentially move up for a quarterback, and the Giants should definitely have that draft pick on the trade block and be looking to get a lot of picks in return for it, because there's definitely going to be a team that wants to jump up for either Justin Herbert or Tua Tagovailoa, and the Giants' fourth pick is a perfect spot to do it.
Yeah, and especially when you look at it, right? So as we kind of get into these hypothetical like draft scenarios in the second half of the show here, I mean, so like look, as I mentioned just now, since he's going Joe Burrow,
Hmm.
Washington and Detroit's gonna be like Chase Young and someone else, and
Hmm.
then you've got the Giants there sitting at 4. And I know you could go and you could still find an impact player at that position, even if it's not Chase Young, because you could end up getting like CeeDee Lamb or Andrew Thomas or Tristan Wirfs. Those are 3 guys that would be legitimate building blocks on this team. And you could legitimately make an argument for those guys by this time next year being like the best players on the team. I mean, but like, look, then when you look down the board, like you've mentioned, I mean, the Chargers need a quarterback. You're not sure what's going to happen with Cam Newton and the Carolina Panthers.
Hmm.
Jacksonville needs a quarterback. I mean, you've got the Raiders at 12. They need a quarterback too. Indianapolis and Tampa Bay are at 13 and 14, and they need quarterbacks. So all of a sudden, that fourth pick, you're right. It could be like a really premium position for them to potentially trade back and accumulate a lot of day 2 and day 3 picks.
Yeah, if someone's looking to get ahead of Miami, who's really like the obvious tank for Tua team there, they're going to have to trade with the Giants. And Dave Gettleman has never traded down in the first round of an NFL draft. And I'm really hoping that that changes this year, because the Giants really are just in prime position to make a trade backwards. You mentioned all those teams that need a quarterback, and I think that now is a perfect time. I mean, that pick, the fourth pick, yeah, you can get a building block, like you said, but you can get a building block with the fifth pick if they want to trade back one with Miami. You can get one at 7 if they want to trade back with Carolina. You can get a building block at any point in the first round, but you can get 3 building blocks or 2 building blocks if you get an extra first round pick or an extra second round pick by trading back.
Well, right, and just to add on to that, I mean, look, there's a lot of needs for this team, that's no secret. But when you look at it, what you're seeing right now is that they don't need. There's positions like wide receiver and offensive tackle that the Giants need. That legitimately, you could argue this draft class is so deep they could find one of those, even if they trade to like the back half of the first round. I mean, this isn't going to be a wide receiver class where it's like, okay, there's only 1 or 2 good guys and teams are going to scramble in the top 10 to find them, or an offensive tackle class or an offensive line class, excuse me, where it's like, oh, a guy like Mekhi Becton, offensive tackle from Louisville, like he's a guy you need to reach for in the first round because these guys will be there on day 2, on day 3. They'll be there, so you just really got to play it safe. I mean, you play it safe and play it smart.
Yeah, exactly. The deep draft classes you could just look to worry about on the second day. And why not get additional picks on day two and get a lot of value from the second rounders? That's what you're going to get if you trade back in the first round. And, you know, as great as players like CeeDee Lamb are and Jerry Jeudy and Andrew Thomas, like you've mentioned, it's marginal value. It's marginal added wins above replacement at that point when you're drafting them with the fourth pick versus if you're getting one of them with the 10th or so pick or the 15th pick, whatever, and then you're getting another few building blocks with your second round pick, with your other second round pick, and with next year's first. If someone offers you that, you can get even more players. And like you said, a lot of holes on this roster, a lot of positions to fill. And I just think trading back is the perfect scenario. You get a lot of things in return. You can get a lot of young players, and that really could be step one to turning this team around.
Yeah, and then you know what another thing you have to keep in mind is this, right? Is it's better to have like 4 or 5 contributors that are solid and will fill a couple extra roster holes or a couple holes on the roster per se, than having like that one super flashy player there. Like everyone wants to have that one super flashy player. That's cool. That's great. Ownership would love it because it's going to put a hell of a lot of, you
Hmm.
know, jersey sales. There's going to be tons of jersey sales. Management's going to love it because it's saving them their jobs. But at the end of the day, it's like, would you rather have like 5 or 6 good contributors and hidden gems that you find like Darius Slayton, or just have like the one really good pick there? And so I think really this fourth overall pick, there's going to be a million different scenarios that you could look at and you're like, all right, you know what? This is what this team can do.
Yeah, and it's exactly the conversation that we had with Will on our last episode about the Giants pick at number two. You mentioned the trade offer from the Denver Broncos. The Giants would have moved back from 2 to 5, gotten an additional first round pick, a pass rusher in Shaq Barrett, and a second round pick or so. And that's a lot of value added. That's a lot of extra impact players that the Giants gave up on for that one flashy running back with the second overall pick. And yes, Saquon's amazing. He's really top five in the league at his position. Even though he wasn't used correctly over the past 2 seasons, you can see he has tremendous talent, breakaway speed. He can make anyone miss on a tackle. But is that really worth giving up all those extra assets for this one flashy running back? And that's the question we're going to be asking ourselves for years to come. And it's Dave Gettleman in a nutshell.
Yeah, and it's really going to be something interesting to watch, and obviously the draft's going to be like the last week of April, so we're going to talk about it a lot. We hope to have some draft prospects on for the listeners. But when you look at free agency, and I know we've talked about this somewhat now as we begin to dig into it more extensively and begin to break down like player by player and what the Giants are going to do. We know that Gettleman's gonna end up throwing a big contract out at someone. So who are you looking at in free agency for the Giants to sign to fill a roster hole?
Yeah, the main player that I'm looking at, especially now that we've ended with the fourth pick and are pretty much out of Chase Young territory, I'm looking at Yannick Ngakoue from the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think that he's a pretty great player. I think he's probably going to be the best pass rusher available unless someone like the Broncos decides to cut ways or cut ties with Von Miller or something like that. But I don't foresee anything like that happening just yet. I think Yannick Ngakoue, I know today he tweeted a peace sign and a racing flag emoji, I guess indicating that he's done in Jacksonville. And he's definitely someone that Giants fans should keep their eye on because he's a talented pass rusher, and I think he would look good in Big Blue.
Yeah, and then I mean it's gonna be interesting, right? Because Ngakoue is one name you've mentioned, but then there are guys like, for example, Dante, and this is a name that I'm super wary of. I think I've mentioned it a couple times before on the podcast. I'm super wary of, but Dante Fowler Jr. I get this is a guy. He was in free agency last year, signed a 1-year prove it deal to return to the Rams for $12 million. He's only 26 years old, so you're not sure where he's a young guy, obviously. Arrow looks to be pointing up, but my biggest fear with him is that he's going to be Gettleman's prime target, and it's going to be an issue because Gettleman's going to throw a big contract at him that he clearly does not deserve, especially for someone that was a top 5 pick a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Dante Fowler Jr. I definitely prefer paying a little extra for Yannick Ngakoue. I think you definitely get more production and efficiency out of him there. And even if you have to pay a little more, I think it's fine because I really do like Ngakoue's game. But also, there are players like Shaq Barrett. I doubt that Tampa Bay lets him go after the season that he had this year, but it's possible. And if Seattle isn't able to get Jadeveon and Clowney in under the cap, that could be a big name on the free agency open in free agency. And then there's players at other positions too. I mean, obviously we talked extensively about the pass rushers already, but you got cornerback Byron Jones from Dallas. He could end up being a free agent because they have to pay Amari Cooper, they have to pay Dak Prescott. They might find themselves up against the cap and have to let some guys go. And there's really a lot of options for the Giants out there when you look at the list.
Yeah, and I think what it is this is there's obviously a lot of different routes that the Giants can go, but they need to be smart about it because again, you don't have like money that you can just blow. You're gonna have to save some money for extensions down the road. I mean, it's crazy to think that in 2 years at this time we'll be talking about a potential extension for Daniel Jones. You're going to be next year at this time. We'll be talking about picking up Saquon Barkley's fifth-year option because that usually ends up happening at the end of year 3 for any first-round pick. And so it's like, okay, you could go out and obviously I never, my stance on this. I don't think you should spend big in free agency because it doesn't make a lot of sense. But you're gonna have to be smart about the way you approach all this.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I'm not really big on spending in free agency. I think, the last two times the Giants have done that, it's come back to bite them. We can look at Nate Solder as a glaring example. He's really turned into a disappointing player these past 2 years. And you can look at players like Olivier Vernon, who didn't even last their full contract with the team, but took up a huge chunk of cap space. Damon Harrison, while he was an excellent player during his time with the Giants, he didn't make it to the end of his contract and still took up a lot of cap space. And Same goes for Janoris Jenkins, who the Giants cut this year after paying him a lot of money. He didn't make it to the end of his contract either. So I don't agree with spending big in free agency either, and I definitely think that they should keep their mind on contract extensions and keeping the young talented players that they have on the roster already here for the long haul.
Yeah, and it's just all about like it. Again, 2019, as we discussed earlier, was a complete mess. Now, 2020, right, as we begin to talk about it, because the season is going to be here pretty, much faster than anyone knows, even though it's really far away at this point. It's going to get here quickly. You're looking for the Giants front office to make smart decisions and then the team just to, at least show some gradual improvement. And it's interesting because you look at it. I know we discussed this with Will too, like who are kind of the building blocks, but at the same time, like who are guys that are going to be free agents for the Giants this year that you're like, all right, I do not want this guy to return because just serves zero value to the team and the team's just better going in a different direction.
Yeah, and another free agent that I want to mention quickly is Corey Littleton. He's an inside linebacker from the Los Angeles Rams, and I think that he's pretty talented. And also Joe Schobert from the Cleveland Browns, another inside linebacker. I definitely think that's a position of need for the Giants, and I think that those could be big impact players to put on the defense and really turn it around, like you said. And the Giants have a huge hole at inside linebacker. I really like Ryan Connolly, but he's a big question mark after hurting his knee this season. And I think Alec Ogletree has been a very poor acquisition for the Giants, and I assume that he'll be gone at the end of the season too. So there's definitely a lot of players in free agency that the Giants could end up filling this roster out with, but they're going to have to be careful not to overpay for these players.
Yeah, and you mentioned Alec Ogletree, and his contract with the Giants runs through 2022, when he'll be an unrestricted free agent at 30 years old. But as soon as the calendar turns to 2020, the positive is that the Giants can cut him before June, cut or trade him before June 1st, and you're saving 8.25 million. If you cut or trade him after June 1st, you're saving $10 million in cap space. And I think when you look at this, you mentioned, so when you look at inside linebacker, we know it's a big need because you can't have all the great defenses in the NFL today, or the good defenses. When you look at them, the middle linebacker position is like what holds this team together, or the entire defense together, because it's like the quarterback of the defense, basically. And you mentioned guys like Littleton and Schobert. And I think a third guy to keep an eye on, if you're listening to while you're listening to this, and just keep an eye on them all throughout the offseason, would be Chicago Bears linebacker Nick Kwiatkowski. And the reason I bring him up is because every time I watch this kid play, right, he's like, whatever, 26, 27 years old. He's going to be a free agent in the offseason. And the best thing about him is that he is going to get a good deal, but he's not going to be as expensive as Schobert or Ogletree. And that's a name that's like not the fastest guy in the world, but really is a tough physical player and fits what New York Giants football is all about.
Yeah, that's a great name to throw out there. Definitely on the cheaper end. I mentioned a lot of higher end players that are going to be available, but the Giants have a high end player from their roster that's going to be available this season, acquired midseason, Leonard Williams. I'm very curious to see what contract Leonard Williams ends up getting. I know Dave Gettleman, he obviously gave up a third and a future fourth if he does get extended to get Leonard Williams. And we haven't seen great production from him during his few weeks with the Giants. But estimates that I've seen, they predict that Leonard Williams is definitely going to get a contract over 10 million a year. That's going to be a huge contract, a lot of cap space taken up on the salary cap, and that's really interesting if they're going to make the decision to let him walk in free agency or not. They could even end up using the franchise tag on him, but I assume Gettleman's going to keep him around for the long haul. I'm just not sure financially if it's the best idea.
Yeah, and when you get spot tracks, so right now, I mean, they've got the Giants, they've got 1.8, about 1.9 million in cap space. I mean, the offense essentially is 44.6% of the cap. That's 13th in the NFL. The defense is 24% of the cap, which is almost 25%. That's 32nd in the NFL. So they're last in the NFL in terms of money allocated to the defense. And then special teams is just 1.2% of the cap. But, when you look at that, right, they're going to need to free up some cap space. I know the salary cap's going up every year, so there should be a couple million more that is going to be available. It's going to help the Giants, but it's not going to help them to the point where they can make a lot of big moves. And you're going to have to free up some of these guys like Ogletree or Leonard Williams. You're going to have to let some of these guys go because you're going to need the space, not just this offseason, for the draft class. Because, again, you're going to be signing a first rounder, but for the future as well.
Yeah, I'm really happy you brought up the percentage of money that Giants have spent on offense and defense and special teams alike. Obviously, the numbers that you threw out there did not add up to 100%, and that's because the Giants are paying over $30 million in dead cap for trading away players with big contracts, making dumb trades that they never should have, or making bad signings that they never should have. And that directly falls on Dave Gettleman. Those are his mistakes. But also, this upcoming offseason, they're going to have a lot of players coming off the books. A lot of that dead cap is going to disappear. And also, we're not going to be paying over $20 million for Eli Manning anymore. There's going to be, I believe the projected number is over $80 million in cap space for the Giants this upcoming offseason. And I do not personally trust Dave Gettleman to spend that wisely. I'm afraid there are going to be some big splash purchases in free agency. And while they might bring us short-term success, as we mentioned earlier, it could be bad for the long term. It could make it difficult to extend the young talent that's in-house. And it could, if they end up trading that player too, could create some more dead cap down the road. So we're going to have a lot to spend this offseason, but they got to be careful doing it.
Yeah, and when I pull it up, so because I'm on Spot Track right now, just looking at all these numbers. If you're looking to, see where we getting these numbers from, check out spottrack.com or overthecap.com. Two excellent resources.
Hmm.
When you look at it, you mentioned 2021. The estimated cap space they have right now, it's like 169 million. That's kind of a flawed number because it's going to end up changing and whatnot when they end up handing out extensions to a couple people here and there. But you're right. They are going to have like 70 to 80 million at best in cap space. And so I think what you need to do is kind of build the roster up via the draft in 2020, and then go ahead in 2021 and sign only like two or three guys that you think are seriously worth it. Because, like we said, and we've said like a million times already, you're going to need the money down the road. Because what's going to happen is when you consistently draft well over a number of years, at some point your good drafting catches up to you, and you're just going to have to end up letting a couple of the guys that you drafted over the years go, because you're going to have to prioritize that. Who do you think is important for the long-term interests of this team?
Yeah, and one of those players that I think is going to have to be let go is unfortunately Dalvin Tomlinson. Tomlinson has been really, really good for the Giants this year and has been really good for them throughout his all of his years. But unfortunately, that trade for Leonard Williams is probably going to be the nail in the coffin. If they decide to extend Leonard Williams and keep him around for the long haul, I think Dalvin Tomlinson, I don't see him getting a big contract extension himself. So I could see him being one of the players that the Giants decide to trade this offseason.
Yeah, and because we're talking about trading him, right? So you're not getting tons of. You're basically getting like pennies and pocket change if you try to trade Dalvin Tomlinson, excuse me, because you trade him in 2020, you're saving like $1 million. You are gonna have like $367,000 in dead cap that you're gonna end up just paying off the books in 2020. But he's a free agent in 2021, and so he could be like very well playing his last season in New York in 2020.
Hmm. Well, he could be, but like I said, I think that if they extend Leonard Williams, you should take what you can get for Dalvin Tomlinson now. Try to trade him and get something for him in return rather than just letting him walk for nothing in free agency the following offseason. This is a mistake that Dave Gettleman's made with a few players, including Landon Collins. He had the opportunity to trade Collins at last year's trade deadline, decided that that would have been bad for the locker room and didn't. And then he ended up walking in free agency, and now at best we will get a third round comp pick, but there was a lot of potential to get more in return for Collins had he decided to trade him before his contract expired.
Yeah, and especially when you look at it, like, again, we don't know who the teams were, but there were like reports and whatnot that you see from people that have blue check marks on Twitter, basically saying, yeah, there were a couple teams that were in on Dalvin, or I'm sorry, Landon Collins. My apologies. That like you did hear a couple teams floated around, and now you're in a situation where it's like not only did you lose him for nothing, but he's playing for a division rival, right? So you need to kind of just call around the league with a specific player, even if in the back of your head you're not going to trade him. At least inquire and see what the price is, because you never know. Like some team could be like, yeah, I need an ideal, guy on my defensive line. I need someone that is going to be cheap because I don't want to go out. I don't want to, I'm not in a position to draft a. Some team's going to be like, look, we're not in a position to draft a good defensive tackle, because those are kind of a rarity coming out of the draft. What we should just do is, hey, you're giving us this guy. Here's what we're willing to give you back.
Yeah, exactly. The Giants should definitely be putting feelers out for their players that they think they could end up trading. And I do think that Dalvin Tomlinson is one of those prime candidates. And I know another candidate was Nate Solder himself. Trading him, of course, would leave the Giants with a lot of dead cap. But I know that there were teams interested at this year's trade deadline looking to trade for Nate Solder. And that definitely could be a name that pops up again this offseason. Maybe a new head coach comes in and decides he doesn't want to coach Nate Solder, and maybe they'll end up getting something in return for him rather than just, cutting him and eating all that dead cap for nothing.
Yeah, and as we begin to wrap things up here, when you look at this offseason, I mean, I think, who do you think is going to revolve around the most? Look, we've discussed draft possibilities, we've discussed potential head coaching candidates. Hopefully, the next time we're on here, you see the Giants having Matt Rhule as their head coach, who Anthony and I stand so hard. Um, but uh, but I think when you look at it, right, ultimately the entire offseason's gonna, in a lot of ways, even though most people don't see it right now, revolve around Daniel Jones, because you've shown that he's the future and you kind of have to build around him this offseason.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be all about building around Daniel Jones, and that's going to play an integral part in choosing the coaching staff, getting the right quarterback coach and offensive coordinator, and especially the head coach in place, one that will obviously support Daniel Jones and do the best that they can to get him to succeed. And then, of course, you got to get him some protection and some weapons in free agency in the draft. This is all going to be about building around Daniel Jones, and it's going to be that way for the next couple of years. We're going to have to set him up and help him develop, and you do that by getting a lot of talented pieces around him and getting the right coaching staff in place.
Yeah, and then you mentioned like the wide receivers, right? So we said a couple weeks ago, Darius Slayton's a good number two guy, but he's not going to be a number one guy. I mean, and we know Gettleman's tendency. No one needs to hear our rants about that again because of him just throwing out like big contracts at, you know, free agents and players that clearly don't deserve it. But because there's a lack of pass catching in New York and they need a true number one guy, I think the best way for them to legitimately address that's going to be through the draft.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be through the draft is their best way because it's just a deep draft class. There's going to be a lot of receivers that are talented enough to be number one receivers on a team falling into the second and third rounds. I don't think that wide receiver is as pressing of a need as some might think for the Giants. I think Slayton and Shepard, and if they keep Tate one more year or two more years, that's good enough. Although I do think there's definitely room for improvement, but I don't think that it's worth it to draft a receiver in the first round for the Giants. I think there's definitely other positions that are, much more important to upgrade for them, especially on the defensive side of the ball. But I definitely do think that they can find another talented piece for their receiving core in the second, third, and later rounds.
Yeah, and then when you like just examining the whole thing, right? Let's like be honest about something. I mean, right now, if there is two needs that if I had to classify the, offensive tackle, right, would be like my number one need right now. That'd be 1A and 1B on my list because it's like you got to shore that offensive line up because like you look at the Cowboys, right? And again, I'm not going to turn this into a discussion about Dak Prescott, but like Dak Prescott operates behind an excellent offensive line. You look at the Eagles, right? I know that Carson Wentz was injured, or sorry, not Carson Wentz, but Carson Wentz's playmakers were injured, but they still have a good offensive line. You look at a quarterback like Pat Mahomes, the Chiefs, good offensive line. So we've seen that like good offensive lines play a much bigger difference than people think in this league, and that's got to be one of the big priorities that the Giants end up fixing this offseason.
Yeah, a good offensive line is massively important for any NFL offense. I mean, it's really hard to develop a young quarterback without having the protection around him and having a solid offensive line for him. The Giants do have a couple of pieces, maybe. You can say Hernandez is probably a good piece to build around. I think Zeitler is definitely a good player that you keep around. And Nick Gates seems like he might be a good player that could stick around for a while, but obviously they need to shore up the center position desperately. I think right tackle needs to be addressed, and so does left tackle. So there's a lot of holes on that offensive line. And as we just stated, it's really important for for a young quarterback to have a good offensive line. Just take a look at Lamar Jackson. Look at the leap that he's taken in his second year. Obviously, his offensive line is one of the best in the league, still being led by Marshall Yanda, an all-pro right guard. And, Lamar Jackson has just gone to an MVP level. And, there's a lot of running involved with that because he's a very mobile quarterback. So obviously the run blocking has been excellent by the Ravens offensive line, but their pass blocking has been pretty damn good too. And it's allowed him to have a lot of time in the pocket to survey the field and make those throws. And it's really just so important. The Giants have to address the offensive line this offseason.
Yeah, and I think that just my offseason priority list for this team is essentially like, look, so first off, you got to find the right guy at head coach because a good coach, a good and bad, here's the thing, coaching is what makes or breaks a team any day of the week, anytime, any season, right? But ultimately after coaching it's like building around Jones and then just being smart on the defensive side of the ball. Now I'm not saying go out and throw like all the money you have in your pocket, right, at a couple guys on defense and think, because it's not going to shore it up. Didn't happen in 2016, so it's not going to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be smart about it, right? And then just fill out the defense with like a couple vets here and there that you think on like cheap 1 or 2 year deals with minimal guaranteed money.
Yeah, exactly. And build through the draft. That's the most important thing. And, you know, my priority list is definitely going to be protecting Daniel Jones. I think getting him an offensive line is number one. Number two is getting a pass rusher, whether that be through free agency. Yannick Ngakoue is a good name, or through the draft if somehow they're able to pull off Chase Young or maybe land AJ Espenza, whatever it may be. And then, this is personnel wise, but of course, the top priority is getting the right head coach in place. We keep setting ourselves back with these bad head coach hirings. Obviously, Ben McAdoo was a mistake, then Pat Shurmur was a mistake. I really don't want to have to go through this again in another 2 years. I really want the Giants to find the right guy this year who can lead this team for the next decade, and that's the number one priority, and it's not even close.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get out of here, Christmas is obviously over, but and the Giants obviously are not playing anymore, and they're not going to be on for another 9 months. But if you're a Yankees fan, a Mets fan, or even a New York Islanders fan or Rangers fan, the thing is, check out our link. Fanatics is sponsoring our network, so go to www.com. Sorry, www.thebearsbrawl.com/fanatics, and whatever gear you buy on there, you actually help grow our network. So be sure to check that out. And then before we get out of here, Anthony, anything last minute you want to add on?
Yeah, just follow us both on Twitter. I'm at Anthony_Rivardo, as we stated earlier. Also, go check out my articles. I write daily articles about the New York Giants over at empiresportsmedia.com. So check me out there and don't be shy. Come after me on Twitter if you disagree with something I said on the podcast. I'm always open for a friendly and kind football debate, and I'm down to discuss Giants football with you guys.
Yeah, and then follow me on Twitter at Usayd Koshal. Yeah, I know I cover the Bears guys, but can talk any NFL team endlessly. So be sure to tweet at me if you hate anything that I said on this podcast. But also make sure you're following our social media accounts as well. So we're at Giants Brawl on Twitter, and then we just launched a Facebook page as well. So just check out the Giants Brawl on Facebook, and then in a couple weeks here, we're actually be launching an Instagram page. So we'll be posting a lot of awesome content on there. But that's it for this episode. We'll see you guys next year in 2020, actually. So peace out, guys.